Okay.
Okay, so as people come in, you'll just click to say you got it. Now, I'm about to introduce the Reverend Dr. John Young, who is the current president of the IARF US chapter, and he's going to do a little opening. So, John, please take it away.
Thank you all for joining us for this Zoom dialogue on the rise of religious nationalism in the world's two largest democracies, India and the United States. These nations are among the most diverse nations on the earth, with sizable groups of citizens representing many religions. We are fortunate to have two outstanding speakers, Nikhil Mandalaparthy and Reverend McGarvey. I am grateful for my colleagues, board members, John Gubbings and Stephen Switchow, for arranging this program, and for all the board and many of our members in executing it. It is supported by the U.S. chapter of the IRF, the International Association of Religious Freedom, the world's oldest ecumenical organization, and the only one embracing the world's full religious and spiritual practices diversity, as it is also absolutely committed to the principles of democracy and religious freedom. In less than a month, our chapter will be hosting another IRF Zoom event, a joint chapters meeting arranged by the very active Japanese IRF chapter and our own. It will be held on Friday, November 11th in the afternoon or evening in the United States. This event will feature dialogues between a Japanese peace activist and a U.S. nonviolent activist, a Japanese Buddhist and a U.S. Buddhist practitioner, and a representative of indigenous peoples from the U.S. and from Japan. Please let us know if you would like to have access to this future Zoom event. As we begin, let me remind us all that nothing in today's program is intended to denigrate patriotism or allegiance and dedication to one's nation of residence, but instead is intended to assert that we oppose any attempt by some in any nation to assert that only their chosen religion or ethnic group deserves to be accepted and embraced as good and full citizens of their nation. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you, John, very much. And one last little note, I want to thank all of our participants who are visiting us from tomorrow, because it is 8 a.m. in Japan. So, gracias, and thank you for being here. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Nikhil Mandalaparthy, who is going to speak about Hindutva, the Hindu nationalism in the world's largest democracy.
Hi, everyone. Good evening / good morning. I'm just going to actually start by sharing my screen. So if you'll just give me one moment. All right. Can everyone see the slide?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So let me just also set a timer for myself here. So yeah, I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you today about the rise of religious nationalism in India. I'm speaking as the Deputy Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights. We are a 3-year-old organization based in Washington, D.C., founded in 2019 in order to really provide an inclusive and progressive Hindu-American public voice, speaking to the social justice and concerning issues of our times. In particular, we advocate for pluralism, civil rights, and human rights in South Asia and in North America. And we provide a Hindu voice that speaks out against caste, against Islamophobia, against Hindu nationalism, and all forms of hate and bigotry. And the work that we do is very closely in partnership and in coalition with other faith communities from across the South Asian diaspora. So we work very closely with Muslim groups, with Dalit groups, Christians, Sikh, secular, sort of spanning the diversity of our communities. And so the topic of my presentation for today is, as as was mentioned earlier, this term Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, which has really become the dominant political ideology in India today. And so I'll just provide a little bit of background and how Hindu nationalism has manifested in recent years, what's actually going on, on the ground in both in India and among the Indian diaspora, and then also how we at Hindus for Human Rights are trying to counter that from within our tradition. So just to start off, I'm sure everyone has heard at least of Hinduism, or as I like to describe Hindu traditions. Hinduism is really a very diverse group of religious traditions which are practiced all over the world. Here in the United States, Hindus make up about 1% of the population. Back in India, Hindus make up around 80% of the population, and there are sizable Hindu minorities in other countries in South Asia, as well as the Caribbean and other parts of the world. So Hindu traditions, of course, are practiced by many different people. They take very diverse forms based on religion, region, and caste, and all of these other factors. And in contrast, Hindu nationalism is a 100-year-old political ideology. This is an ideology that emerged around the 1920s, which, as people may recognize, was a time of rising fascist movements in Europe, whether we're looking at Nazi Germany or Mussolini's Italy. In the 1920s and 1930s, this sort of right-wing extreme kind of ethno-nationalism found a very willing audience in India. As the Indian independence movement was taking place and the struggle against British colonialism, there were two sort of visions that emerged for what India should look like. And as was mentioned earlier, India is an extremely diverse country, whether you look at religion, language, caste, class, across the board. It's as if, all of Europe was one country. It's really that level of diversity. And so there were two competing political visions of what India should look like, when the British leave. One was a vision of secular India, an idea that India should be a pluralistic society where people of all faiths and no faiths equally belong, despite there being a Hindu majority. And then the other vision was of a Hindu nationalist state, or what is called a Hindu Rashtra, or Hindu state, one in which Hindus, because they're the numerical majority, should be able to basically set the terms of what Indian government should look like, Indian society. And this was further emboldened by Indian independence in 1947, when British India was split into India and Pakistan. The Hindu majority regions of India Hindu majority regions of British India became independent India. Muslim majority regions became Pakistan and also what's now known as Bangladesh. And so there was this movement in India, although the country was declared a secular democracy, there was an undercurrent of right-wing extremist movements who said, if our neighbors, Pakistan, get to be an Islamic republic, Islamic state, why don't we make ourselves a Hindu state? And so that's really one of the important moments in the rise of this ideology. And Mahatma Gandhi, was a longtime independence activist and advocate for Hindu-Muslim unity. He was assassinated in 1948 by a Hindu nationalist extremist who believed he was too soft on Muslims and things like that. And the Hindu nationalist movement has been active ever since Indian independence. And it's been at times, driven underground, sometimes given more airtime. In the last several decades, Hindu nationalism has really been on the rise, just as we've been seeing rising religious nationalism across the world, and particularly since 2014. In 2014, Narendra Modi was elected as Prime Minister of India. This photo of just one of many of Modi and Trump's appearances. I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later in the conversation, but under Modi's rule, Modi belongs to the oldest Hindu nationalist organization in India. He's a lifelong member, and his political party, the Bharatiya Janata Party, or BJP, Indian People's Party is the translation, is a Hindu nationalist party. And so under Modi's rule, we've been seeing rising violence against religious minorities in India, whether it's Muslims or Sikhs or Christians or other communities. We're seeing rising attacks on human rights activists, on journalists, students, academics, and really just a decline in civil liberties and religious freedom, particularly for minorities. India has been increasingly polarized under the BJP government and even the years preceding that. And so I just want to share a few statistics from just last year that show just exactly where we're at in terms of radicalization and polarization in the country. So based on a survey done by the Pew Research Center last year, 85% of Indian Hindus, who are the majority population, actually said respecting all religions is very important to being truly Indian. And at the same time, you look on the other side, 64% of Indian Hindus say it's very important to be Hindu to be truly Indian. And so there's this tension that's playing out right now in India. Is that, like, what does it really mean to be Indian? Can a Muslim be considered truly Indian? Can a Christian be considered truly Indian? And what's happening is the voices from the government and from right-wing media and just across the board are increasingly giving more and more fodder and airtime to the latter, the idea that Indian identity should be synonymous with Hindu identity. Along with that polarization, we're seeing kind of a drifting away between religious communities, where today 66% of Hindus and 64% of Muslims see each other as very different. 65% of Indian Hindus and Muslims see religious violence as a big problem. At the same time, only a fifth of Indian adults say that Muslims actually face a lot of discrimination against their community today. And just to give a degree of how baked in like Islamophobic and like beliefs have become in mainstream Indian society, this was a survey that showed that almost 80% of Indian adults believe that India's Muslim population is growing too fast. And for people who are familiar with religious nationalism and in other cases and just right-wing ideology, like the idea that a certain minority is reproducing too quickly, or that they're having too many kids and stuff, that's a trope that we've seen play out in countries across the world. And it's reached the point where social media has been a really big factor in driving religious violence and extremism. And a study from just this past year found that 55% of Islamophobic tweets come from India. And so India is despite having one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, over 200 million Muslims live in India today, India is really becoming this extremely Islamophobic society. And that's really at the core of Hindu nationalism, is predicated on this idea that Muslims and then also Christians can never truly be Indian. And part of that is because their sacred sites lie outside of India. And so there's like this idea that there is some disloyalty to India because your religious sites are in a different country. So to just give a few examples of how this ideology is manifesting in India today, this past December, a group of Hindu extremist leaders organized what they called a parliament of religions, essentially a Dharam Sansad in a sacred city in North India. And officials from the ruling party in India were present at this gathering, sitting in the audience, and we received media reports of quotes such as saying that, like Myanmar, the police, army, and every Hindu must take up arms and organize a cleansing of Muslims, and saying that even if 100 of us are willing to kill 2 million of them, that's enough. That's what we should do. And these are quotes from Hindu religious leaders, extremist leaders, addressing an audience and inciting calls for genocide and mass violence. Another issue that's really been popping up in India increasingly since 2014 is lynchings, which is something that I think we're all familiar with in the American context. Racially motivated lynchings in India, what we're seeing is religiously or caste motivated lynchings, particularly of Muslims and of Dalits, who are formerly called untouchables. These lynchings are often driven by suspicions of cattle slaughter, because many Hindus consider cows to be sacred, or allegations that a certain Muslim home has beef inside, or that you're transporting beef. And what we've been seeing is actually, in many cases, police, law enforcement, and government are on the side of those who commit lynchings rather than those who are being lynched. And so this is just one example that was from a few years ago, where one of the cabinet ministers in India held a kind of this public garlanding of 8 men who were convicted of lynching. And it was a highly criticized moment, but it just shows the degree to which the ruling party is actually supportive of and inciting this sort of this violence. I do want to note, I know I'm supposed to just talk about India, but this isn't just an Indian problem. I do want to talk very quickly about the Indian diaspora here in this country. There are about 4 million Indian Americans living in this country today. We're the second largest immigrant group in the US, and about a little bit over half of Indian Americans have immediate family who still live in India. And so it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of the polarizing attitudes taking place over there have carried over to our communities here in the United States. Nearly 60% of Indian Americans believe that religion is responsible for creating divisions within our community. And it's actually reached a point of so much polarization that just over half of Indian Hindus in the US feel very comfortable having close Muslim friends, and less than half of Indian Muslims in the United States are very comfortable having close Hindu friends. So even though it's umbrella, all part of the Indian American community, there are real tensions that are showing up here driven by what's happening back in India. One very quick example happened in August this past year at an Indian Independence Day parade in Edison, New Jersey, a town which is home to a substantial South Asian population, where one of the parade floats was a bulldozer featuring photos of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, and the Chief Minister of India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh. And the reason why this was so polarizing was because in India, bulldozers are being deployed to demolish the homes of Muslim activists and Muslim neighborhoods, people who are critical of the government. The local administration sends in a bulldozer and basically says, that home is actually illegally built, or cites some sort of violation, and then demolishes their house. And so this is an article that our team actually put out in The Nation. It follows a very similar pattern to what we see in Palestine also, where bulldozers are deployed to demolish Palestinian homes and businesses. So that to see that on the main street in a Indian Independence Parade in New Jersey just shows how much that this polarization has seeped into our communities here. And so I just want to conclude by sharing a little bit about what we're doing at Hindus for Human Rights to fight against the Islamophobia and religious nationalism in our community. One very obvious step, of course, is just building relationships with Muslim partners. So we work with a number of Muslim American organizations. Our closest partner is IAMC, which is Indian American Muslim Council, but we work very closely with a number of these groups across the board. We do a lot of work to counter misinformation and disinformation, which I'm sure will be another topic of conversation later on. But whether it's on social media or WhatsApp, trying to basically debunk a lot of the myths and hateful ideas that are being spread about Muslims and other minorities among our communities. We do a lot of work to confront hate, speaking out, and that involves actually speaking out against other Hindu American organizations who are more supportive of Hindu nationalism and the right wing. And so our co-founders have the honor of being sued by the largest Hindu American organization in this country for speaking out against Hindu nationalism and the support among our community for Hindu supremacy. And then finally, we're just trying to get more and more of our community members to speak up. And so this past year, we put together a statement following a string of different Islamophobic incidents. And in India, we felt like it was imperative for Hindu religious leaders to really speak up and step up. And so we had a statement put out, signed by dozens of religious leaders across 6 different countries. A number of Hindu temples also signed on. But it's still a work in progress because, Hinduism is one of the largest world religions, and it was just a small drop in the bucket of priests and temples and religious leaders who felt like actually compelled to speak up in support of our Muslim brothers and sisters. So a lot of work to go. But really at the end of the day, we're trying to adopt a very holistic approach to violence in South Asia, because I've been talking a lot about India specifically, but in India, where the situation is Hindus in power, Muslims are being persecuted, you go to any of India's neighbors and it's actually the reverse. It's where in Pakistan, Muslims are the majority, Hindus and Christians and others are being persecuted. Same in Bangladesh, Afghanistan. And so a lot of the Hindu nationalist groups will say, like, look at those countries, look at how barbaric Muslims are there. Like, this is why we should be tough on Muslims in India. Whereas we are trying to come in from a more holistic perspective, where we say we actually stand with any persecuted minority without regard of which background they come from. And what we're opposed to is actually religious nationalism itself. And the only way we can prevent violence against Hindus in Pakistan is not by being worse to Muslims in India. It's about actually standing up for each other's rights to thrive and survive in a pluralistic society. So it's a long way to go, of course, and the situation in India is quite worrying, and unfortunately the current government will very likely win the elections next year and stay in power until 2029. But we are trying to do all that we can at Hindus for Human Rights to really activate and wake up our own community to see just how Hindu nationalism really is a threat to our own tradition and our corruption of our highest teachings of peace and tolerance and justice. So I look forward to putting this all in juxtaposition in what's happening in this country, but I'll stop here for now.
Thank you, Nikhil. Very informative. I'm the Reverend Will McGarvey. I'm the Executive Director of the Interfaith Council of Contra, Costa County. So grateful to be here and with you sharing conversation about nationalisms in India and those here in America. Lots of overlap. Let's start with a land acknowledgement. As Interfaith Councils, we understand land acknowledgements as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and to build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. As people of various faith traditions and life philosophies, we affirm our responsibility to amplify Indigenous voices and stand in solidarity with our local Indigenous communities, the Chochenyo Ohlone, the Bay Miwok, and the Tachiyokuz people, all of whom have a relationship with the tallest mountain in our area, that the colonizers called Mount Diablo, but the Ohlone called Tuishtak. Bay Miwok and Tachiyokuz had different names for it. We recognize that the cultural heritage of California begins no less than 23,000 years ago, and that the entire Bay Area rests on evidence of indigenous cultures. The pre-contact indigenous population in California was one of the largest and most diverse in the Western Hemisphere and spoke over 300 Native American dialects and as many as 90 languages. Today, there are approximately 9 indigenous dialects spoken in the Bay Area, and California is home to more people of Native American and Alaska Native heritage than any other state in the country. There are currently over 100 federally recognized Native American tribes in California, and even more communities and tribal groups, including the Ohlone, who are not currently federally recognized because of the California Indigenous Genocide. California has the highest Native American population in the country, and Los Angeles and San Francisco have 2 of the largest urban Native American populations in the United States. It's important for us to remember the context upon which many folks are expressing their Christian nationalism right now, that it is on the same footprint of not just the California Indigenous Genocide, but the national genocide here in California as well. That might make it a little easier for you all to see. Let me get these boxes off of the presentation screen. Oh, what happened there? That was weird. Hold on a sec. Let me start the screen share one more time. Well, that's interesting. Okay. I don't know where my extra share screen is, but let's see if I can get it
The
set up
button
correctly again.
should be down at the bottom in green.
Yeah, I've got it, and for some reason it stopped working the way I wanted it to there. So here's some images that kind of express Christian nationalism, and it really is a movement that's attempting to preserve white and Christian power in many ways. And you'll notice that there's a lot of familiarity in the symbolism that folks use within this, but it also uses a lot of scripture and even a lot of European symbols, as we see in this one, with all of the different fleur-de-lis and even Irish and German symbolism in the Christian nationalism. Sometimes when we're used to seeing it, it shows up in the news like this that we saw in the Getty images, in a form of Jews will not replace us, right? And a lot of folks of whatever white heritage, sometimes using Confederate and even Nazi symbolism. This became a really scary thing that a lot of folks hadn't seen for 40 years or so here in the United States. But as we're seeing a lot of these symbols come out of the woodwork again, we're recognizing that that Christians probably need to speak up more to not be associated with folks that are using symbolism and using their religion and a form of Christian identity politics. But a lot of this really does come from the fundamentalist movement. And R.J. Rushdoony said there can be no tolerance in a law system for another religion. Toleration is a device used to introduce a new law system as a prelude to a new intolerance. Every law system must maintain its existence by hostility to every other law system and to alien religious foundations, or else it commits suicide. This is a view that really does try to protect white male Christian privilege over every other form, with a form of kind of hyper Calvinism. But it also shows up in other forms as well, especially as it gets married to a modern political party. As Ken Burns said, what part of Donald Trump reminds you of Jesus Christ? Trump lusts after his own daughter on national radio, talks about women's bodies and breasts in such a disparaging way, and mocks them. How is this in any way Christian? When you make the other the enemy, how is that Christian? But it was very much a part of an evangelical marriage of their religious groups with a political party and other parts of the far right Catholic movements as well. So it wasn't just Protestants, it was Catholics and Pentecostals and a few others. But it has led to a lot of violence, and a lot of these violence that we're used to seeing, even Charleston and Christchurch in Norway, were inspiring each other. And so we can see that US Christian nationalism has been exporting itself, but also borrowing some of the patterns from Orban's Hungary and even Erdogan's Turkey and a few other places. So when we speak of white nationalism, that's usually as a subset of this Christian nationalism, a movement that interprets white heritage as a unique race, and that this race should advocate for separate defensible space and a defense of white American culture, whereas white supremacy is an ideology that seeks to create institutions within government that privilege and reward whites due to inherent gentle and cultural superiority. Alt-right is a new term, a newer ideology developed on the internet in far-right hatred that blends modern elements of white nationalism with more misogynistic beliefs in gender roles. Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry define Christian nationalism in this way. They say, survey after survey finds that close to half of Americans are at the very least supportive of the fusion of Christianity with American civic life. These Americans believe that Christianity should influence our public policies, sacred symbols, and national identity. Scholars find, however, that the Christianity of Christian nationalism brings with it a host of other assumptions about who are true and rightful citizens, namely that true Americans are white, culturally conservative, and natural-born citizens. We can see some of this even showing up in some of the conspiracy theories of QAnon and others. And Thea Butler, who wrote a great section called What is a White Christian Nationalism, has been studying especially evangelicalism. And she says that an understanding of the basic ways white Christian nationalism has worked has a unifying theme for a particular type of narrative about America. She says that narrative can be summed up as follows. America is a divinely appointed nation by God that is Christian, and it really does blur these lines between patriotism and nationalism. The patriotism that a lot of us feel for our own country, taking it too far is really the definition of nationalism as well. But Anthea says, one, that America is a divinely appointed nation by God that is Christian. Two, America's founders, rather than wanting us to disestablish religion as a unifier for the nation, were in fact establishing a nation based on Christian principles with white men as the leaders. Three, others, Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and immigrants, would accept and cede to this narrative of America as a Christian nation and accept their leadership. Four, that America has a special place not only in world history, but in biblical scripture, especially concerning the return of Christ. And number five, that there is no separation between church and state. As Stephen Colbert would love to ask, if this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit that we just don't want to do it. So for all of those that are really pushing that America is a Christian nation, and whether that's folks like D. James Kennedy with the Presbyterian Church of America denomination that was teaching a revisionist history that said that we've always been a theocracy, or that we need to return to a theocracy to be truly American, without recognizing that in 1789, when we had a constitutional convention, we rejected theocracy. Partly because of what we saw that it was doing, ripping Europe apart and actually sending so many people here looking for a way out of it. I love this quote. I stand for the flag out of respect, not worship. I kneel for the cross out of worship. Take it or leave it. Noam Chomsky even recognizes that the people in the Bible who were the false prophets were honored. It was the ones we call the prophets who were jailed and driven into the desert. But this really has become such a big part of American culture that it's really difficult for us to recognize this, because this pendulum keeps swinging back in this direction multiple times. It was in the Wilson administration in the early 1900s that we saw the silencing of dissent. The Espionage Act in 1917 prohibited the use of mail to send treasonable materials. The Seditious Act of 1918 barred disloyal utterances, and a lot of these acts were used to get rid of the so-called left and people that were trying to hold the nation accountable, especially for the way it was treating minorities. And it's no shock, or shouldn't be a shock to us, the way that folks continue to have to ask for their own civil rights in this country, because the pendulum swings so far after civil rights, but then it swings back so far in response to that during the Reagan administration and so many others, where those rights and protections get diluted. If we were to look at the Hebrew scriptures, we can see that oftentimes they're being used for some of these, especially the dispensationalist forms of Christian nationalism, those that are focused on an end times theology, but even dominionist, those that are really focused on power and taking over the 7 mountains of power, use a lot of these scriptures as the basis for calling out those who are false prophets if they disagree with them, rather than recognizing that the true prophets are the ones that are calling for justice. Tzedakah is what God calls us to. But there's a lot of portions of the scriptures that get used not only as a warning against false prophets, but sometimes these same warnings get used by folks in the Christian nationalist movement to keep people from taking a look at the really troubling theologies and anthropologies that they have. There's been some really great writing, fortunately. This article from The Atlantic, American Christianity's White Supremacy Problem by Michael Luo, I highly recommend, as well as books by Robert P. Jones, who's done some amazing research on this over the last few years. The End of White Christian America and White Too Long. I think White Too Long is the latest one that has come out. David Berry's Blood and Faith, Christianity and American White Nationalism, quite an expose. And some are from a more secular position, like Did America Have a Christian Founding, which really tries to fight back against some of those myths that some folks in the religious right have been retelling in their version of history. The Inventing a Christian America, The Myth of the Religious Founding by Stephen K. Green, and even Benjamin Leinard's Republican Theology, A Civil Religion of American Evangelicals. Others, like Michelle Goldberg, has written about the rise of Christian nationalism as a kingdom coming. Every patriot who still checking the freedoms we inherited from the nation's founders should read this book. And it's even showing up in some Catholic circles in forms that we're seeing in this book by Betty Claremont, The Neo-Catholics Implementing Christian Nationalism in America. Of course, as I mentioned, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel L. Perry's Taking America Back for God, and Stephen Green's work on the myth of the religious founding are some of those that are coming from the more secular places, like The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, and Gregory Boyd, The Myth of a Christian Nation. One journalist that's looked at this was called Catherine Stewart, The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Christian Nationalism, where she has said breaking American democracy isn't an unintended side effect of Christian nationalism. It is the point of the project. So as we recognize this, we really need to recognize that they're really trying to overturn constitutional, even republicanism, America as a republic, a representative democracy, in order to be able to try to put the symbols of the Ten Commandments or their own faith tradition more and more into the public sphere. And it's been interesting to see the number of folks that are reclaiming KKK and Confederacy symbols and recognizing that its power has been something that continues to be a current rather than past identifier here in the United States. And especially during the last election, Trump supporters, 3549 out of 10,000 sampled Trump supporters follow one or more of a select 10 white nationalist Twitter accounts, which was something that we hadn't seen quite a bit of during a presidential race, even though we've seen Twitter kind of black holes where people only speak with each other in certain parts of Twitter around Christian nationalism. During the Clinton-Trump election, these were some of the numbers of the way people were identifying in 2017 as a strong Christian nationalist or not as a Christian nationalist based on their party. And of course, the Southern Poverty Law Center has pointed out that we have 940 hate groups in the United States in 2019, 55% increase in white nationalists since 2017, and 43% increase in anti-LGBTQ hate in that same time, which has led to domestic extremist related murders in the United States, even happening here in the United States with the violence from 2008 towards 2017. So it took the election of one black man to really be able to push a lot of these folks out of the holes that they'd been in for a long time, and to become much more public with their ideological violence. These are just the notable murders by white supremacists in those 3 years of 2015 to 2017. And a lot of them are crediting Christian nationalism as the reason why they are doing the actions that they are. And it's also had an accompanying idolification or idolatry of Trump himself. Here's some of the images that we're seeing from folks on the right that have really kind of put Trump on the same level as the leader, or at least who should be the thought leader of the Christian faith, Jesus Christ himself. And so we've seen this blurring of the line of states towards crosses and a lot of this, and some of it comes from movements like the Project Blitz playbook, which has really been using multiple steps to get to their goal of obliterating the wall of separation between religion and the government. And passing those bills and misusing religious freedom to justify discrimination. And it does kind of come with a persecution complex of those that are spouting it the most, rather than a recognition that the position that they've taken is an affront to the Constitution and the separation of powers as they were. So this was one way that in the beginning of the Trump administration that we saw a lot of this was being pushed. Since the loss of Trump in 2020, we've been seeing new forms, especially this reawakening tour where General Flynn and Team America is coming to different places near you with different speakers that are a part of this MAGA movement. And whether it's General Flynn in his kind of Catholic version, or Mike Lindell in his evangelical version of Christian nationalism, and even Roger Stone has been quoted approvingly of his relationship with Jesus Christ being the inspiration for his anti-American work. Faithful America is one of the groups that I've seen that's doing some of the best work publicly about exposing the religious right on this. Here's a quote from Jennifer Butler, who leads this group. The Reawakening America Tour has given a platform to extremist politicians and leaders who spread disinformation and promote dangerous rhetoric, especially targeting Black, Brown, Muslim, and LGBTQ people. As a Christian pastor, I cannot allow my faith to continue to be hijacked by white supremacists covered in religious language. Of course, Gordon Martinez from Texas recognized that Christian nationalism is a perversion of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Instead of emulating Jesus and acting as prophetic voices for love and truth, false prophets like Steve Bannon act as priests of this empire. We hear a lot of this even more recently from Colorado Republican Lauren Boebert, who said the church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. This is really funny coming from someone who is elected to the U.S. Congress, that they don't even recognize this. But we're also seeing the rise of Christian nationalism all over Twitter feed, as we saw with this graph that's been tracking some of it. In April 22, there were 39,000 tweets. July of 22, 289,000 tweets with Christian nationalist phrasing, and then around 200,000 tweets with Christian nationalism in all of 2021. Reverend Jackie Lewis from Middle Church in New York City said, kind of points out, and Jesus will say to them, I asked for shelter and you sent me 1,800 miles away in protest, referring to the governors that are trying to be like Trump and send migrants to other states. This great quote from Reverend Dr. Christopher Spott: Lauren Boebert's blasphemous claim that Jesus did not have enough AR-15s to save his life is a complete distortion of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection. Jesus proved that the powerlessness of violence through his death, while Boebert twists the gospel to advance her own hateful agenda. It really is a movement around power and using faith towards power. As Brother David Vryhoff said, we belong first and foremost not to our country, but to God. Our true citizenship is in the kingdom of heaven. Our identity as people of God takes priority over our national identity. And Stephen Dundas, a retired U.S. Navy chaplain, said, we are actively witnessing the demise of the Establishment Clause and protected liberties of all at the hands of Christian nationalism. We must vehemently reject all rhetoric that threatens American freedoms now, including the inaccurate interpretation of the gospel fueling Christian nationalism and the Reawakening Tour. But this was also written in response to Supreme Court, which has pretty much captured a whole court with members of the religious right in order to move ahead their patriarchal and an agenda that the minority of Christians in America really do support, in the disestablishment of women having the ability to have control of their own body. We have to remember that even though there are some folks spouting this, that Christianity itself, it isn't Jesus's fault, and there are folks that are trying to work against this, whether it's Phil Snyder in Preaching as Resistance, or Chris Hedges, who's been really good on this for some time. He's a fellow Presbyterian ordained minister of mine who continues to be one of the best voices, I think, for really exposing the religious right and their war on America, and really their attempt to take over through theocratic means. Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove is one of the thought thinkers that's been with the Poor People's Campaign and working with Reverend William Barber with the Poor People's Campaign. His book on the Revolution of Values, Proclaiming Public Good for the Common Good, is one of the better books on this. And Prophetic Rage, A Post-Colonial Theology of Liberation by Johnny Bernard Hill is also helpful. Marcy McDonald's The Armageddon Factor, The Rise of Christian Nationalism in Canada, points out that it's not just an American thing, it's going on up there as well. In fact, I would argue that it's somewhat actually American Prophets there by Jack Jenkins is another good book. I would argue that this is part of our legacy of the British Empire, and perhaps that's why it's both America and India that are struggling with this the most. Guthrie, Graves, Fitzsimmons, Just Faith, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity and Always With Us was what Jesus really said to the poor by Liz Theo Harris, the other thinker with Reverend William Barber, and the Poor People's Campaign are other good resources to help correct this. But a lot of this comes from our ideas of America. And one of the biggest myths of America is our Thanksgiving myth, which tells us that those poor Puritans ran away from Europe because they needed religious freedom. And when they got here, it was the Native Americans that saved them from starving. That's not the way Native Americans would teach that. If anything, they would expose that Thanksgiving myth that the Puritans were here for religious freedom is almost laughable. I've written, if you want to take a look, and I'll put this in the chat room here in a minute, if you want to take a look at what I've written. Oh boy, where did it go again? Let me see if I can get it back here. No. That's the weirdest thing. Let me start over with the share again. And where did we go? Whenever I tried to do something outside of, that's not it either. I guess I couldn't put it just in the chat room, or it went to the chat room, but it's taken me out of my sharing. Let me try to get this going again with the images. There we go.
Yeah, I see the link in the chat room there.
Yeah, it made it finally. No worries. Sorry about this, folks. But anyway, that really is a myth. As someone who serves a Presbyterian and United Church of Christ congregation and have studied this era, those pilgrims came because they weren't able to enforce their own religion in England. They tried to go to Denmark and the Netherlands, and it didn't work for them there as well. So when they saw an opportunity to come here and have land to be able to create a city on the hill and to be able to try to prove to England and the European countries that they could create a form of vigorous Puritanism and make people live according to it. That's what they were really trying to do, and their actions really are more consistent with that than coming here just for religious freedom itself. It's why each of the 13 colonies had different faith groups, but it's also interesting that when we became a federal nation, that most of our founding fathers saw through this desire to keep Christianity at the core. George Washington said, "Be courteous to all, but intimate with a few, and let those few be well tried before you give them your confidence. True friendship is a plant of slow growth and must undergo and withstand the shocks of adversity before it is entitled to the appellation." He also said, happily, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no acceptance. In his letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, he wrote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his or her own vine and fig tree. There shall be none to make them afraid." He sent this letter to them because they helped push the ratification of the First Amendment and declared Thanksgiving as a day to acknowledge Almighty God. And yet he's the same man who wrote this letter to one of the first Jewish communities in Rhode Island. The purpose of separation of church and state, says James Madison, is to keep forever from these shores the ceaseless strife that has soaked the soil of Europe with blood for centuries. And the civil rights of none shall be abridged on account of religious belief or worship, nor shall any national religion be established, nor shall the full and equal rights of conscience be in any manner or on any pretext infringed. Thomas Jefferson said, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their civil as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes." He also said, "I contemplate with sovereign reverence that that act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. So a lot of these founding fathers get quoted in different ways by folks on our religious right, regardless of whether or not it's an actual truth, but most of them were deists, right? Most of them were children of the Renaissance. Most of them were getting ideas not just from their religious upbringing, but also from the hope for true democracy coming out of Europe and France and other places. As George Washington said, the bosom of America is open to receive the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to participation in all of our rights and privileges. They may be Muslims, Jews, or Christians of any sect, and they may be atheists. So it also includes the protection from religion. Sam Ervin said, political freedom cannot exist in any land where religion controls the state, and religious freedom cannot exist in any land where the state controls the religion. Even modern Republicans like George H.W. Bush said, government must never promote a religion, of course, but it is duty-bound to promote religious liberty, and it must never put the believer at a disadvantage because of his belief. One of the things that we've been doing as an Interfaith Council is trying to be in conversation with humanists and atheists, as well as those of other life philosophies and faith traditions. And in doing so, we really do have to be willing to do so as equals, and recognizing that there are arguments that get made in our world that can sometimes be made from a religious perspective that have unintended consequences, as we've seen with the Supreme Court move against Roe. And, a lot of these questions come up. Can Christians carry guns and Bible at the same time? When does life begin? These are faith questions that don't have to have a political answer. And even as we saw with the recent Roe decision, President Biden said, I accept my church's position on abortion in my personal life, but I refuse to impose it on equally devout Christians, Muslims, and Jews. I do not believe we have a right to tell other people they cannot control their body. And there's been lots of great work by religious folks, especially on center left and left around religious reasons for reproductive justice. But as one of the things that I've been pointing out to folks in our area is that that recent SCOTUS decision actually took away the religious freedom of Jews to be able to practice their religion when it comes to abortion, because their answers to those questions is different than the few Catholics and right-wing evangelicals that got their position enshrined. And, sometimes we're told that extremism comes in waves, just surf it. And, that's why we're supposed to have the protection of these rights as a constitutional democracy, because these rights aren't supposed to be negated for any of us. Now, Nikhil shared a little bit about some of the things that have been happening in India that are somewhat central to what a religious nationalism that we might see in Israel. And there's a strong connection between evangelicals and the religious right here in the United States and the Christian Zionists that are pretty much looking to Israel for a lot of the things that they're doing as well. And it's brought about a really kind of strange bedfellow for a lot of these folks, because anti-Semitism, as Lily Levine says, anti-Semitism is dubbed history's oldest hatred for a reason. It has existed for as long as our otherness can be clearly defined. This form of xenophobia is not grounded in pro-Palestinian sentiments. Anti-Semitism is grounded in white supremacy. So when we see the mixing of these two philosophical positions as well, we're seeing a lot of folks that are saying anti-Semitic things as well as their white supremacist things, and they're kind of merging in QAnon and a lot of other movements as well, even while they're taking some of the examples that Israel is using against Palestinians, like home demolitions, as permission in India and other places. That hasn't happened here yet, but that's one of the things I'm more afraid of. As Sophia Leitner said, it's high time that Christians take a strong response on violent Christianism and white supremacy in America. A strong response would emphatically state why these violent ideals do not align with the faith. So I'm heartened that there's groups of Christians against Christian nationalism. I know that the American Baptists and Southern Baptists and a lot of those, the Baptist Joint Committee, get this because that they've been, it's so central to the origins of their faith, but a lot of Presbyterians who were preaching the Revolutionary War because they recognized British nationalism and what it was doing to the colonies at that time were also very much against it as well. So when we look at some of the symbolism that they're used, it's interesting that even some of our Presbyterian confessions are written against the Christianization of the Nationalist Socialist movement of Nazism, and it's so interesting that so many of these symbols are coming back again as symbols of power. As Sarah Posner says, Christian nation mythologists pump themselves up with narratives of American exceptionalism and Christian domination, but sooner or later, even their most devoted followers should begin to see that also depicting it as vulnerable to non-existent threats undermines the myth itself. I love this test for theology. If your theology doesn't lead you to love people more, you should question your theology. And we really should believe, if we believe in something, we should be willing to sacrifice. Maybe not everything, but sacrifice enough to see that it comes about. So an ally's role is to activate other allies, amplify the voice of marginalized communities, attend actions to support marginalized communities, and always listen first, according to the UCC. And that means standing with those that are being marginalized, and whether that's historically marginalized or currently marginalized, and really practicing the solidarity to which we are being called, and whether that's the gay people and the LGBTQ folks that are being targeted. It's focusing on those atheists and other folks that are being targeted for being unbelievers. But it's a little hard these days, as we can tell even in cartoons like this. Yeah, I'm a Christian, but I'm not like one of those crazy Christians, you know. Amen, me neither, man. So, you know, in some ways, some folks are still looking for a language for themselves as a Christian, because the public communication channels of so many on the religious right have taken over in such a way that a lot of people believe that they're the only real Christians that are out there. But there's a lot of Methodists that are doing a lot of this work. Episcopalians are doing a lot of this work. Other folks that are even non-denominational Christians are doing a lot of this work and really working on a lot of the symptoms as well. The United Church of Christ has a faithful witness at the border every week, but a lot of us are doing work on protecting voting rights as human rights. I love this quote from Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We're called to a way of love that creates a community in which the dignity of every human being is recognized and respected. The violence, intimidation, and distortion of Christian scripture associated with Christian nationalism does not reflect the person and teaching of Christ. So we do need both the pastoral and the prophetic to be able to break through the myth making that and the power of the religious right that has been swaying so many of these folks. Sophie Leitner again said, the mission for Christians in America today may well be to reconnect with the identity politics Christians, to fight white supremacy and Christianism at its roots, to reclaim the hearts of Christianists in our nation. This is really hard work, and it's even harder to stay in relationship with folks that have been convinced by this world. And so part of that's the personal work we have to do as a part of our anti-racism work, but part of that is figuring out how do we stand with those groups and movements within our own denominations, like the Matthew 25 movement in the Presbyterian Church USA, calling folks back to service of the least of these, and really reclaiming what does it mean to really be a Christian in terms of love, care, kindness, compassion, and serving the least of these rather than the power games that we're seeing from the right. Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons, another great quote. We can contest the meaning of Christian in the public square if progressive Christians in the United States come together and do what's necessary. But a part of that is talking about justice as the expression of Christ's love, and loving neighbors as an expression of that. Loving our neighbor means we work for the collective liberation of all people wherever and everywhere, and aren't content with having enough for ourselves. So rather than just negating that we're not that kind of Christian, one of the things that we've done at the Interfaith Council of Contra Costa, we put together a 4-part series called Coping with Nationalism, Searching for the Soul of a Nation, Religion, History, and Politics. And Father Tom Bonacci, who leads the Interfaith Peace Project, is the main teacher on this. It's on our YouTube channel. It's free. You're welcome to use it in any of your congregations. And it really is about coping with nationalisms and understanding how, when this pendulum comes to swing again in our midst, how can we be prepared to have those hard conversations, and identifying the problem, exploring the doctrine of discovery and its role on this, and then the relationship between systemic racism and coping with racism and nationalism together. We also have some other interfaith skills series there. So if any of you are interested in our Diffusing Hatred program or Everyday Peacemaking program or Courageous Conversations, those are all there for you. And we also have some anti-racism training that we've been doing for the last 3 years. COVID's been a blessing for us because it's allowed us to record almost all of our programs and put them onto that YouTube channel that I'll just put here, that YouTube/C/Interfaith Council of Contra Costa County is where you can go to get all of those.
Great.
So I'll leave you there with, and I'll put this in the chat room for everybody.
Excellent. I can mention that I have actually watched those YouTube videos, and for those who are concerned with Christian nationalism, specifically here, they're excellent videos. And Will and Nikhil, both of you, thank you so much. What I would like to do at this point is go into a mutual dialogue with Will and Nikhil. And I wanted to let everyone know that as this goes along, if you've got questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat. And after Will and Nikhil feel that they have had enough of a mutual dialogue, we can go into the questioning. And Kathleen Moran will be kind enough to go ahead and read those questions. I wanted to start off the dialogue between the two of you in terms of religious texts. Both Christians and Hindus have religious texts. And I know at least in Christian nationalism, very, very often, the Christian nationalists are going into the Christian texts, the Bible, as justification for their beliefs in establishing the United States as a Christian nation. So I'm curious with both Nikhil and with Will, where your religious texts may be used in terms of justification for what is going on in Christian nationalism and Hindutva. So I will open it up to our two speakers together.
I can start off perhaps. Yeah, in Hindu texts, Hinduism has a very wide range of texts that are considered sacred or important. There isn't just like one kind of central text, and for many Hindus, Hinduism is not necessarily a textually oriented religion. There's many other ways of practicing and relating to the faith, and so because of that, I don't know if there's as much of a textual element to Hindu nationalism. It's more definitely weaponizing of different religious symbols, different deities. For example, the god Rama has really been taken on by the Hindu right as their kind of poster boy, and then turned into this very hyper masculine, aggressive kind of figure. And that's same has been done to Hanuman and other deities. But in terms of texts, I very rarely see Hindu nationalist groups kind of going to the Gita or Upanishads or other sort of scriptures. I will say that the Gita in general has been, the Bhagavad Gita has been interpreted by people from across the political spectrum, and there is a sense of, the setting for that text is a battle, and so the crux of the Gita is Krishna telling the warrior Arjuna, it's your duty to fight this battle. And of course, we can interpret that as a fight for justice or for peace, or a fight for establishing a Hindu state. And so that sort of imagery does lend itself, to either goal. But it's an interesting question. I never really thought about text being weaponized in our context, at least.
And some Christians use text, and some are more focused on liturgy and ritual. So I think for Catholics, I think it's much, theocracy is much more a something that they're used to in Catholic countries. So for folks that come from Poland or other places that have kind of no separation of religion between church and state, and as the Catholic Church is the majority, many Catholics are just used to having an official church of the state, whereas most Protestants are the ones that are focusing more on scriptures than Eastern Orthodox and Catholic. So your Protestants and your Pentecostals would probably use 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and I will heal their land. That's one that's used a lot by Protestants. But people have different rationales for why they are supporting nationalism. For some, it might be a return of Catholicism in power. But for Catholics that have experience living in the United States or Brazil, where there's a separation of church and state, it's actually rather novel for most folks in the world. Most folks don't live in a place where there's a strong separation of church and state. So that's why a lot of even the Protestants that I've been mentioning and looking at that are part of this dominionist movement, which really are looking at overtaking the 7 mountains of power, whether that's the educational system, the media system, the corporate system, really trying to put Christians in power over each of those 7 mountains. That's what they mean by taking power. It's not just religious power, it's taking political power in those secular zones and putting good Christians that believe like them in charge of them so that they can create a more white evangelical friendly culture. Does that make sense? That is what helps them believe in reclaiming their own Christian supremacy. And that's pretty dangerous, as we've seen on January 6th and in many other places. So I would say it's partly texts, and I think the book of Joshua gets used in this realm quite a bit for those that are textually oriented, but for those that are ritually oriented, it's less about the text and it's more about the culture of their own tradition.
Thank you both for that. I know often it feels like a tremendously uphill climb for both of you in terms of what you see as success. So I'm curious that I know neither of you would be in this if you didn't believe you could make some headway. So let me ask both of you where you see signs of progress, or if you see signs of progress in terms of your efforts to reach people and, from my perspective, shake some sense into them about the dangers of religious nationalism. Nikhil, if you would first, and then Will.
That's a good question. I think throughout the last few years in India, there has been a real crackdown on people who are standing up for, equality and against religious nationalism and discrimination, whether you're talking about students or activists or journalists, academics. And so there's been this real chilling effect in Indian society where even the most mainstream media outlets will not run critical kind of coverage of when it comes to the government, things like that. At the same time, India has seen really like vibrant and powerful like people's movements that have still managed to pop up even in this environment. End of 2019 and beginning of 2020 was the rise of these massive protests against this citizenship law that was put in place by the current government, which basically was discriminatory towards Muslims, and coupled with another legal effort would essentially kind of forebode this idea that the Indian government would strip Muslims of their citizenship. And so there's these massive protests across the country, which really were started and led by Muslim women, and were taking place everywhere. And it was really just because of COVID that a lot of that kind of had to fizzle out and wasn't able to continue. But we saw a year later these massive farmers' protests were against the Indian government, where those have, I think, been called the largest protests in world history. It was like thousands and thousands of farmers who were protesting agricultural laws passed by the Indian government had come to Delhi and protested, and it was over a year of sit-in kind of protesting, and so there have been these moments where people have actually galvanized and stood up despite all the challenges, and so that's been very inspiring. And even here in the US, I think a lot of young people, like on college campuses, are very actively kind of worried about what's happening back home. And we're, growing up here, you realize, as Hindus, we are a religious minority and a racial minority in this country, and seeing the importance of, civil rights and equal protection under the law, it's very startling to see other Hindus kind of support of the opposite of that back home in India. And so trying to, I think a lot of young people are seeing through that kind of cognitive dissonance and saying, if we oppose religious nationalism here, we also will speak out against it back home.
And Nikhil, what about the suppression of voices in Kashmir? Are they connected at all with this?
Kashmir is very, very important in the like Hindu nationalist kind of project. And so that's been a extremely repressive and brutal policy on the part of the Indian government towards Kashmir. Because for those who are not aware, Kashmir is this disputed region in the northern part of India, which is claimed, parts of it are claimed by India, Pakistan, and China. And Indian-controlled Kashmir is the only Muslim majority state in India. And now, actually, as of 2019, the Indian government under Modi revoked its statehood and demoted it to a union territory, which allows basically for more control from the central government and less autonomy for Kashmir. And the region was put under internet lockdown for months. And so, yeah, the repression of Kashmiri Muslims is an integral part of the Hindu nationalist project. And we're seeing now more and more measures being taken to allow Indian Hindus to settle in Kashmir, to take away Kashmiri land. And it's a weaponization of the plight of also Kashmiri Hindus, who are a minority in Kashmir and were driven out by Islamic extremist activity. A real sort of lack of attention to the needs of that community, instead of just using their plight to fuel anti-Muslim sentiment more broadly. So yeah, Kashmir is a very important, and thank you for bringing it up.
And Will, what are you seeing in terms of success in this uphill effort?
Well, I think the myth of America being a Christian nation is so ingrained in most of our thought because of the Thanksgiving myth, but also because so many people have been teaching this revisionist history for so long. or even talking about other nations as if the majority of those other nations should have the right to be able to impose their religious as well as secular ideals and values on the rest of the culture. One of the things that I've been pointing out is that being a Christian nationalist and asking for a theocracy is actually anti-constitutional. That what you're doing is you're saying, I'd rather that the Constitution not be in effect. And I think that grabs people in a way that just saying, well, yeah, America's a Christian nation because the majority of its people are Christian, whatever that means. But I'm also the one that jumps on the light end of the teeter-totter that says if there are 2 billion Christians in the world, there are 2 billion Christianities. And they might be different from day to day, because as people learn and grow, they might adapt and add new values of living with more compassion or living with more loving kindness to their neighbors rather than less. And if we help folks understand that this was created as a secular democracy against the state-based religious majorities of those 13 original colonies, most of which were Protestant. When we understand that Maryland had to be created as a Catholic colony so that there would be a safe place for Catholics in the United States, the 13 colonies were not all that Christian. As far as living out the ideals of Christianity that allows everyone to exist, and the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech and the freedom of being able to congregate with other people with like-minded worldviews. Those are all enshrined in our Constitution in the 1789 Constitutional Convention that gave us that. And then we've been adapting to become more democratic with every amendment to that Constitution that's been added over the years. And I think it's so important that the freedom of religion and the freedom from religion is enshrined with our freedom of speech and the freedom of association. And the more we can help people understand that that was a different kind of decision that didn't allow Congregationalist majority in Massachusetts to continue to lord it over their neighbors as they were used to doing since Plymouth had landed. The other big thing that I think surprises most Christians is that the Declaration of Independence that was written by a lot of those folks, and as I said, one of the terms that some people use for that in the history books is that it was a Presbyterian revolt, because Presbyterianism came from the Church of Scotland, and the Church of Scotland was used to having the Church of England trying to lord it over them. And because of British imperialism into Scotland and Ireland and the history of those folks that understood that, they wanted to be sure that there would not be another opportunity where the Church of England would lord it over their religious freedom. And the way to demand that comes to pass is the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, and the freedom from religion. If we didn't have those protections, if those founding fathers didn't understand that we could be just like the religious wars that were killing tens of thousands of people as people were fighting after the Protestant Reformation, and a lot of those were political power games where sometimes a prince would choose to become Catholic or Protestant depending on which group of other princes, and that a lot of the nation states in Europe weren't nearly as whole as they are today. Most of Italy was still tiny little nation states with little fiefdoms over a lot of those areas. When we truly understand the history and we understand what the founders were trying to do by creating a secular, non-religious country to preclude ourselves from these religious wars, having someone tell us that our history is wrong basically exposes that they've allowed themselves to become a pawn in this potential future war of using religion as a basis for conflict with others for power. And when we understand the real impulse behind that, and even that Declaration of Independence, this is one of the things that I just learned this last year that it surprised me even. Those founding fathers, one of the things they put in the Declaration of Independence was, one of the things that they were upset with the British Crown for was that they were asking the founders in 1776 to make peace with the Native Americans. And the people in the 13 colonies wanted to continue to colonize First Nation Native Americans more than what the British Crown was allowing them to. It's one of the reasons why we declared our independence from England, was to be able to stick it more to the Native Americans than we already were.
Okay, well, thank you. I just got a note that Nikhil is going to have to leave us in about 5 minutes. So let's, I notice questions are coming in. Kathleen, did you want to field a question for Nikhil before he has to leave?
There are no questions on the chat.
Oh, really? Well, I'm seeing them. I see one here from it was from Rose directly to me. And it has to do with the fact that both the US and India are essentially stepchildren of the British Empire. And the question was about the religious legacy of the British in terms of what we're dealing with now with both Hindutva and Christian nationalism. So, Nikhil, before you leave, if you could maybe address that question, I appreciate it. And I thank you in advance for being here today.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very, very important question. I mean, British colonial rule devastated India in so many ways and really also gave rise to what we're seeing playing out today. I think actually one maybe unexpected way in which colonialism has created what we see now is through the census, the colonial census that was implemented in India. The census was the first kind of time where these ideas of majority, minority, numerical power were all being brought into like the public sphere in India in a very systematic way. Of course, before that, there were, ideas and of course there's administrative, taxation, all of these things which required bureaucracy, but the census that was implemented by the British was very intentionally asked questions about religion and let people only select one option. They said, either you're Muslim, you're Sikh, Christian, or the rest just came under the label Hindu. And so there was this consolidation process of like these very diverse traditions, which were not necessarily seen as necessarily part of the same umbrella until the colonial
And Jainism
period.
wasn't counted as its own religion in that?
Sorry?
Jainism?
No, I mean, like a lot of these traditions were seen as just sects of Hinduism or similar kind of, it was really the dichotomy was Muslim, Christian, and then other, or like, which is Hindu. And so also by only letting people select one option, that really like diminished the ways that people express their religious belonging in India. And you see this in the colonial records of like the first few rounds of the census. You have communities across the subcontinent who said they were Muslim and Hindu, or that they were, Hindu and Sikh, or like, labels like that. And those sort of like pluralistic, syncretistic identities were really what most of the subcontinent was like before the British came and said, actually, you have to pick one, you can only be one of these. And then, of course, with the census came the results of, it's X majority Muslim, X majority Hindu, and this move to really govern based on that principle. So that's just one way in which colonialism played into what we're seeing today.
Wow. Thank you
Stephen.
so much for being here.
Betsy does have a question here. If Nikhil can linger and answer.
Sure.
It's for Nikhil. Are there commonly accepted tenets and values in Hinduism that can be held up to the nationalists, similar to holding up humility and care of the poor to Christians?
Of course, yeah, that's a great question. And definitely, I mean, the highest teachings of many Hindu traditions are in direct conflict to the type of violent and aggressive religious nationalism that's at play now. And so there's, I mean, many Hindu traditions teach that the divine is fundamentally present in every person equally. And if you really take that to heart, then like there is no basis for caste discrimination or religious discrimination or any sort of differentiation of people and hierarchies. And so just like that, I mean, Hindu traditions teach about nonviolence as an important principle, about tolerance and accepting all different paths as going to the same goal, or the importance of speaking the truth. And in our organization, we have, you know, for Hindus for Human Rights, we talk about Shanti, Nyaya, and Satya. Shanti is peace, Nyaya is justice, and Satya is truth. And so, absolutely, I mean, you look at any religious tradition, you have those universal values that can counter any sort of exclusive political ideology. And yeah, I think with that, I'm unfortunately, I do have to step out now, but really enjoyed being able to share a little bit about what we're working on. And thank you for taking time to listen.
Thank you for your
Namaste.
presentation, Nikhil.
Thank you.
Namaste. Namaste.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. For folks who are putting in questions, I noticed that all the questions seem to be coming directly to me. And at the bottom, where in the chat, there should be a way to click on the blue thing that says who you're sending the message to or the question, and then it should be for everyone or for Kathleen. So until we get that fixed, perhaps I can go here and see. Here is a question from Mark. What strategy should we understand that political entrepreneurs have used to appropriate religion in their quest for power? So, shall I repeat that one, Will?
Yeah, please.
Okay. What strategies should we understand that political entrepreneurs have used to appropriate religion in their quest for power?
Well, I think we need to understand that they're using some overgeneralizations and this retelling of history that they've been so good at for the last few years. Probably needs to be resisted more. So a response to that needs to be able to teach the real history of the United States as a secular democracy with freedom of religion and freedom of expression for all, and that includes freedom from religion, from coercion. It's for those that are using just the general cultural understanding of history of majoritism that can be used towards this. I think we need to continue to lift up the diversity of this country and why folks are drawn here, because it's a place where each of us are allowed the freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and freedom of religion to live according to the dictates of our own conscience. And that conscience shouldn't be compelled by the state. That's a really big one. And if Christians want to create a country where they can compel other people's consciences, that would be outside of the United States, because this is so core to who we are. And this is one of the reasons why we're as successful as we are in drawing other people from around the world that want to live here, is because that they'll know that they'll be able to live according to their own conscience without compulsion. So I think that freedom of religion and freedom from compulsion should be a big one. And those are really big values in Muslim, in Jewish, in mainline Christian worlds as well. But maybe we need I think that this is one of the reasons why some people are choosing homeschooling for their children, so that they don't have to teach this level of diversity to their own children. It's so that they can pretend for their own children to be able to live in a Christian country. So maybe we need compulsory historical education, regardless of faith tradition so that we can bypass some of those folks that are trying to keep their kids from learning about this history, because it really is a form of indoctrination that's become a detriment to us as a country. The number of Christian symbols that were used at the January 6th insurrection should be a point of real concern for all of us as Americans as well. That an insurrection would be baptized and blessed with religious imagery of one group over another explains why there's so much Islamophobia in these groups, but also why they view themselves in a culture war against other people of faith. And I think we need to help disabuse folks through education on that. But I don't know another way to do that without bruising each other's conscience because of the way that the homeschool movement is being used to shield some young people from that view.
Thank you. I have a statement here from Jerry, so I'll just read it. Searching for textual justification for Christian nationalism is diversionary. Religious nationalism is driven by political, not theological motives. Those with no moral compass and no conscience will appropriate any material to justify their control of the reins of power. Mythology, not history, forms the context for these movements. Religion is just another facet of human culture hijacked to serve political ambitions.
I'd have to agree with that, and especially for a Christian identity movement that has married white supremacy with their theology and uses that as a way of giving cover for ideological violence against people that don't believe the way they do, is un-American as well.
So I'm trying to see if anyone else has questions they would like to go ahead and put into the chat.
I see nothing more.
One's on the way. Should I just speak mine?
Yeah.
I'm a slow typist, so
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Will, you said that mainline Christians are searching for language to define themselves apart from the Christian nationalists. And I would say that we in the U.S. chapter of IARF, our name, means it spells out as International Association for Religious Freedom. I'm searching for some very clear, brief language to explain how we are not some of the people who who want to duck laws like equality laws under the cover of religion. Do you have any suggestions? You can think on that one.
The hard part is that they've kind of used religious freedom as the new framing for their discrimination laws, right?
Exactly.
So
yeah.
they're trying to use that as an excuse for their ability to discriminate against other people when they've run out of every other secular legal way to approve that. So maybe we need to maybe we need to reclaim religious freedom for all as one aspect of it. But I think there's another aspect. The hard part is that we have so many qualifiers, right? I'm a liberal Christian, or I'm a progressive Christian. I'm not that kind of Christian. People feel guilt by association because this group has become so prolific in their communication channels and cable channels as well as radio channels, and they really invested so many millions of that in the 70s with the rise of the religious right that there's whole books on the elevation of the communication channels of the religious right and why many people view them as the only real Christians in America. And I'm not sure that we need a religious left to answer the abuses of the religious right, because then I'm afraid we're going to start seeing some abuses from the religious left too. So I think it's healthy that folks want a different set of terminology for themselves because they don't want to be smeared by this. The sad thing is that so many on the religious right don't realize that this is why their children and grandchildren are leaving the faith, because they don't want to be associated with a faith tradition that discriminates against their friends or subjugates women in these political ways that they have. So, speaking out more as individuals might be one way of doing that. Joining a group like Faithful America or Christians Against Christian Nationalism is another way of doing that, to point out that Christians are not of one mind when it comes to this, and that we feel as if our faith tradition is being used for political purposes, I think is the best way. And ask folks, please don't politicize my faith. It means a lot to me. It inspires me to be the best person that I'm called to be, and that includes loving my Muslim neighbor and standing up for my Jewish neighbor who's under attack. Please don't participate in those systems, even if your pastor is encouraging you to do so. I think we'd have more power if we together worked against the Johnson Amendment, and we know that even though President Trump tried to do away with that with an executive order, it only lasted during his presidency. So we need to actually perhaps need to ask and report congregations that are over politicizing the faith to the IRS, because they're continuing to do that, which is no longer legal per se, because of the Johnson Amendment is back into enforcement. And really ask for the Department of Justice and other organizations to take a look at those organizations that are blurring this line of the separation of church and state again. But because I think that's one of the reasons why they're as open about their theology as they are these days. So they haven't been called on the carpet.
Right.
And maybe we need to really encourage the Department of Justice, and there is a faith office around religious discrimination at the Department of Justice, to be able to really start to send some letters to some of these groups that are abusing this, because just because they've married themselves to a political party doesn't mean we have to accept it.
It's interesting that you bring up the issue with the IRS, that years ago, the Baptists had set up a website called Rat Out a Faith. It didn't last very long, but what they were doing was sending people from their congregations to visit other churches, especially Unitarian Universalist churches, to listen to sermons. And if they heard anything that sounded the least bit political, they would report it. And it finally ended up being 86th. There's a couple things here. One is paraphrasing lines from Upton Sinclair, quote, "When fascism comes to America, it will be draped in a flag and carrying a cross," unquote. And
Chris Hedges used to read that quote all the time. And I think so many people just kind of poo-pooed the whole idea because they'd never seen it in their lifetime until the last 4 or 5 years, when we've seen that come to pass.
This is something you mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring up, and it's about that pendulum. And the pendulum has swung to the left, and now it's swinging way to the right, but it's still swinging. And I'm wondering, from a historical perspective, because it is now swinging to the right, it was eventually over on the left. And I'm wondering what it was, when we go back to the time of the Wilson administration, what it was that actually caused that pendulum to go back from the right towards the left. And if we can see that happening again, what are the strategies for that?
Well, I think we've already peaked to the right. And I think because we're seeing as many people resisting Christian nationalism, it's moving back to the center. It's hard to tell where we are in that pendulum swing right now. This election might give us a few more clues as to where we are on that, especially if we see a repudiation of the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and the Lauren Boeberts and others that have been pushing Christian nationalism as open as they are. Because all that really is Southern Christian culture supremacy, right?
Mhm.
Even if you're a Colorado House of Representatives representative, as Lauren Boebert is, she's pushing a Southern Christian version of Christian nationalism when she's trying to say that the government is not the government answers to the church doesn't answer to the government. That's not what the Constitution says. So we have a lot more civic education to do.
Of Congress
The
people.
separation of church and state is the law of the land, whether our House of Representative members accept it or not.
Mhm.
And the more we can reteach a history that helps people understand that all of our fundamental values are protected when all of them are protected, including our bodily autonomy, rights should be protected from a religiously inspired Supreme Court. There's lots of different arguments I would use. So it would depend on who was in front of me and how much time I was able to use to really discuss with them where they were coming from.
It's interesting. I have to point out that this type of vileness has always been under the surface, and it was only in the previous administration that it felt empowered enough, if I'll use the metaphor of coming out from under the rocks. And I mean, when I lived in Houston in the mid 70s, I've been Buddhist now for 53 years. And when I lived in Houston, someone in my apartment complex found out that I was Buddhist. And I came out one morning to find my car soaked with the words, "Idol worshiper, go to hell." So that was someone that snuck out from their rock at night to do the soaping and then went right back under the rock again. And yet now all the rocks have been turned over, which in a way, do you feel that the fact that these people are coming out openly racist, openly homophobic, openly Christian nationalist is actually a good thing because we can see them, as opposed to simply having them, like the bottom of the iceberg under the water?
I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks partly, but I'm worried that there's still some real abuse happening. And as an out person who identifies as an every gender loving person, I know how hard it is for teenagers to live in a household that doesn't allow for that form of freedom of conscience.
Mhm.
To feel safe and to be who you are. That's not an easy place to be for a lot of queer folk, especially after you've already won some of the legal challenges to your rights that made it all the way through the Supreme Court. To hear Justice Clarence Thomas discuss that he has ways of trying to question women's place in society and queer people's place in society, and even everything but the loving decision, right? According to the form of the way he would question some of those precedents set in the Supreme Court. That's there's still a lot of fear that kind of comes to me when I see those kinds of statements being made by Supreme Court justice, who's proven that he doesn't want to live according to the law, in that he won't recuse himself from conversations that he's proven that he shouldn't be a part of. So even though the pendulum may be swinging and the exposure may be happening, I've had conversations with avowed white nationalists on Facebook. And when I pointed out that white nationalism is a subset of white Christian nationalism, he's tried to tell me, "Oh, I'm just a white nationalist. I'm not a Christian nationalist. I'm just a white nationalist." And that all it means is that I want to live in a neighborhood with people that look like me. And when I point out that that's still a supremacist position, whether it's a religious one or a secular one, he didn't have an answer for me. I think there were some folks that really thought that they could come out as a white nationalist and be accepted because it's this kind of intermediate position between Christian nationalists or white Christian nationalists, that they could just be a racial superiority, someone who believes in their own racial superiority and that they only want to live near other white people, as not being all that much different than Black people choosing to live in a Black neighborhood.
Wow. So I notice we're rapidly losing people on the East Coast because it is getting towards 9 p.m. Will, I want to thank you for your willingness to participate in this dialogue, and I hope everyone feels that they have gained a perspective by listening to both Nikhil and Will. And there is a question. We have recorded this, and once we find out where it's going to end up, I will make sure that a link to the recording will be sent to everyone who participated today so that you'll be able to watch it at your leisure, because a number of people weren't able to make it today. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for being here today and making this effort by the U.S. chapter of the International Association for Religious Freedom what I feel is a success. So thank you all so much for being here today, and for our Japanese guests, Gasho, for the Hindus, Namaste, and for everybody else, thanks a million.
Okay.